morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here, and I look forward to, I'm really intrigued by this concept, so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and learn from all of you and how this works. But to learn from you not only about the process, but about your experience. In my role at the County Office of Education, I'm the administrator of our Safe and Supportive Schools. So we work with schools in lots of different ways, and ultimately it's to positively influence and impact the experience of the student and family. And so learning from you hopefully will also help infuse into the work that I do. So I'm appreciative of my learning ahead. But I'm going to be talking about the concept of cultural humility and kind of cultural humility versus cultural competence. But before we begin, I'm wondering if, how many of you are familiar with the concept of cultural humility? Okay, how many, and so have some of you been through, raise your hand if you've been through training? Okay, great. Awesome. So I'm going to kind of just give the overview a little bit, and then I'd like us to get up and kind of move a little bit and get to think about who we are. Because one of the things about cultural humility is it's more about what we bring and how we engage our families, and less, it's kind of the meshing of the head and the heart, and I hope that will make sense a little bit. So we're going to talk about culture, and you know, we're definitely encompasses all different layers to culture. So our ethnic culture, our culture of this region, the culture of your organization, the culture of all the different layers of our identity, from our sexual identity, our sexual orientation, our ethnic identity, what is our socioeconomic experience, both now as a professional and ways that feels like to work here in San Mateo County, and how we were raised and what was our socioeconomic status growing up and how that impacted our perspective of the world. So we're going to unpack all of that a little bit and think about the families in which we serve. And the three dimensions of cultural humility, there's three principles. And just as a little bit of background, this concept came out of, came out of Oakland. And what happened is after the Rodney King beating in LA in the 90s, the folks that were working at Oakland's Children's Hospital started noticing that there were folks, the community in which they were serving was not matching the doctors and many of the nurses' ethnic identity. So there was definitely a cultural disparity. And so one of the things that some of the doctors noticed there is that the folks coming in they were experts in their experience. And so while the doctors and the nurses had their expertise as far as the medical knowledge, they didn't have the expertise about the experience of those in which they were serving. And they wanted to think how to bridge that. And so out of that work has come this concept of cultural humility. And there's three elements to that, and one of it's lifelong learning. To recognize that, you know, again, in their experience, they could have gone to medical school and invested tons of money and time and energy and been really dedicated, and they have this unique expertise, but again, it's that medical expertise that may or may not match the experience of the person in front of them. And how do they serve the person in front of them authentically and respectfully and in the way in which that person needs us to show up for them. And so they definitely recognize that all of us, even if we have a lot of like kind of book knowledge, who are we as people, and what are how have we been shaped, and what are the ways in which we look at the world, how have we been impacted the world, positive and not, and then what are ways that we're kind of the fish in water, where we're swimming and we don't even realize we're in water until we get out of the water. And lots of folks, there's a disconnect. And so some of us, it's really apparent. So full disclosure, I moved up here from San Diego 2 years ago, and I was really struck by the culture here in San Mateo County. And I was struck by that. I thought, awesome, California, an hour away on a flight. You know, I had assumed that there wouldn't be such a cultural kind of disconnect for me. But San Diego, and my experience in San Diego, as far as like how we interact with people and the ways in which relationships are built, it felt very different than it does for me here in San Mateo County. And I'm seeing a head nod. But as I talk to some people nod their head, and others that I talk to that are from here, they're looking at me and I think they can appreciate what I'm saying. But again, having grown up here, lots of folks have talked about seeing the change with the tech and seeing how this culture has changed. But it's different when you're new to the culture. right? And so kind of how do we take our experience, pull it off to the side, think about it, and then insert it back into ways in which we work with our families. So we're going to get a little bit of opportunity to do that today. And that's kind of the first principle of cultural humility. The second one is to recognize that there's power imbalances. So that can look like a lot of different things. One of the things is in our culture, in our United States, we've been based on intentional power imbalances, right? So here we are in San Mateo County in 2018, doing our work in schools with families and our programs, but we're definitely still impacted by these cultural power imbalances. Can anyone think about some historical power imbalances that are still at play today? What are some power imbalances kind of in our culture, in our country?
Gender inequality?
Okay, yeah, gender inequality. So we're definitely kind of seeing a resurgence of that conversation right now about how men and women interact, how pay happens or equal pay happens or doesn't happen. So definitely. What are some other examples?
Sexual orientation.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? So until fairly recently, people who our culture is heterosexist, right? So it kind of prefers and benefits those that identify as heterosexual. So for those that don't identify as heterosexual, even though now they have some advantages and some rights, they're still nowhere close to the same. There's still power imbalances that need to be addressed. Right, perfect example. Yeah.
How about the quality of schools in affluent communities and poor communities?
Yeah. Can you unpack that a little bit? What do you think is behind that imbalance of some with more resources versus others? Yeah, so perfect. That's a perfect. So here our schools are funded off property taxes. Property taxes are funded off the housing cost. So it's inherently connected to wealth or lack of wealth. And so what our children get, and many of you know this, that it's really the zip code in which you were born that is the biggest indicator for your lifelong outcomes. So, and a huge part of that is the zip code I'm born in has advantages in the school and services and resources or not. And yet when I show up at 5 or 4 or whatever age, I have no influence on that, but immediately that starts to shape my access or lack of. What are some other power imbalances that we historically have had in the U.S.?
Religious. Marginalization of specific religious groups, especially now very publicly.
Yeah. So what are some religious groups that kind of had more power and have more power? And can we think of some examples of how that Christian or kind of the Protestant Christian groups have benefited and continue to benefit in ways that others may not? So he being Mormon, right? So he being Mormon, that was not the norm. And so that became an issue, right? Definitely. What are some other ways that Protestant Christian has more power or access or privileges in our society versus some of the other faiths? Perfect. Yeah, so here, the ways in which we function and days we show up to work or not are connected to this religious calendar, right? And actually going back to Sudi's point around sexual orientation, so much around that is based in the kind of the religious foundations about and how religion has shaped laws. And so definitely, so our calendars are the ways in which we kind of, our norms, our weekends and how certain folks, that's consistent with the ways in which they and their family, worship, and other ways it doesn't match. What are some other power imbalances? You guys are doing a great job. Let's talk about race and culture. What are some ways that power imbalances around race and culture show up and have shown up and continue to show up in our culture, in our schools, especially in programs? So when we're talking about power, which group, if we're talking about ethnic culture, which group has historically had the most power? Right, white European, right? What are some examples of how that group has benefited? Right, so in our school systems again, right? And so are you seeing the parallel of how the ways in which our schools are kind of enforcing some of these power imbalances? And I also want to point out that our educators are oftentimes just delivering the curriculum in which they've been advised and asked to deliver. But again, that's a perfect example. The ways in which we study history and the perspectives and the stories we're told historically have been from the white European version of the story, and in some ways, it's absolutely been false, and it's in many ways absolutely denied the experience of others. And that still happens, right? Perfect. What are some other ways that we've seen kind of that race or that ethnic power imbalance come into play and continue to? Yes, that our government literally drew some lines around certain communities that were able to get access to home loans and others. And so only certain groups of people, in fact, many records actually, at that time, the law would state that only whites or European Americans, whatever term they were using at the time, could purchase in this certain area. Absolutely. And then that goes back to the funding, right? So now if we look at who those communities are, those tend to be the historically wealthy communities that have the better schools. And so even though this might have happened 2 or 3 generations ago, children today are still riding the wave of that advantage. Right. Perfect. Yeah, and if you look at who is our student body versus who has access to AP classes, which we know even access gets you more success in college. Some of the other kind of opportunities that look really impressive to college and are really strong protective factors for that young person in lots of ways. There's only so many slots, so who gets in? I remember about 15 years ago when I was working as a counselor in San Diego, my assistant principal came in and said, we need to cut the statistics class. So each of you counselors need to pull 8 of your students out of this statistics class. So I remember, that was my first year, and I remember saying, okay, so how do we contact the families? How do we look at this? And some of my colleagues said, oh, you don't, you just randomly select. And when I looked and paid attention to who they were selecting parents that probably were not as comfortable to come in and advocate, and they were probably not the parents that were gonna pick up the phone to complain, right? And so lots of really overt and covert ways that certain groups continue to be advantaged.
And it was under the disguise of random.
Right,
So they can-
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. On the housing, I remember, again, I moved up here 2 years ago. I did not understand what was happening here, what I was moving into. So I came up here and I remember being in a meeting. I didn't know how crazy the housing situation was here. So I showed up to go rent a house, and it was just me. And it was one of those things, I don't know if any of you have rented recently, where it's like, I'm gonna be there on Tuesday from 3 to 3:45. If you're interested, show up. Which seemed really odd to me. And so when I showed up, I couldn't believe the number of folks that were in line to get in 45 minutes. When I walked in there, I did not have to be worried that my skin color was gonna work against me, right? I did not, there were certain advantages that the way in which I present and the way in which most folks look at me because of these cultural dynamics. Certain folks have advantages and certain folks don't. And that comes into play in lots of different ways. All right, so we talked about gender, we talked about sexual orientation, religion, we talked about some race and culture. What are some other ways of power imbalances? Harley.
English speaking.
So can you talk about ways that you see that come into play and certain folks benefiting? Our system in itself, right? Our programs and the ways in which we're funded. Government funding is great, and that's important, and theoretically it's equally accessible, but it's not, right? We know that, and yet that's our goal, which is part of why we're here. Is there another hand up? Yeah. And another crossover that intersection potential doesn't have to be, is now what's really salient in a different way for us in our nation is immigration status, right? So the way in which the immigration status is always had this historical layer of power and, power imbalances, but how is it uniquely at play right now? How are we seeing it kind of harm our families and our children?
There's the immediate threat of deportation.
Yeah. So after election, we saw an increase in bullying on our campuses. We saw a decrease of all children coming to school. We saw a distrust between families and schools. One of the other things I do is a lot of human trafficking work. So we see exploiters that are convincing undocumented folks that they can't turn to resources and support, so they're uniquely positioned to be additionally harmed and exploited and used, right? So the immigration status is at play in really significant ways. It always has been, but it kind of ebbs and flows. Similar to the gender, right? We're seeing a lot more gender talk right now. It's always been there, but the way in which we're talking about it and thinking about it is a little bit different. And that's the ebb and flow of social dynamics. Okay, and then our third principle is institutional accountability. So one of the things, and we're going to unpack these a little bit more, but again, going back to the originators of this concept from Oakland, it's, wow, we as the doctors with this really solid book knowledge and these real, these talents, we have some, book knowledge, but we need to keep unpacking the ways in which maybe we're biased, both explicitly and implicitly, and how our kind of intention and impact aren't matching. And so the more that we continue to think about that and unpack it, I call them blind spots, right? So what are ways in which we might not realize that we're positively impacting an experience or negatively? And again, for us on the front line in our goals of really passionately wanting to support all students and families, sometimes we have some of our own undercurrents at play, right? That can undermine even our desire. And our parents and families, we have multiple currents at play, and sometimes we can unpack them and we realize them, and other times we don't. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. And then, but recognizing that. And again, we talked about more institutional and kind of the U.S. power imbalances, but are there power imbalances in your own organization? Of course. Yeah, of course. And that can be definitely connected to those kind of ones that we just talked about, but then there's other layers, right? We were talking about, for one of the organizations, kind of like those who live on the peninsula versus those who have to commute, those who have children and have other commitments outside of work versus those who don't have to, hit their car at 3:30 to get to their daycare. And so ways in which some folks get access and support versus others. So these can come in a lot of different ways, and we're going to look at that a little bit. But really, ultimately, once we do this work and we start our journey, how to have continued commitment to improve our institution, to bring courageous conversations back. And again, I think oftentimes there's intention and impact. And so it's matching that maybe a policy or service you might have intended or thought it might be a good thing, but maybe after our conversation today, you might think about it a little differently and then have the courage to take some of that back. So thank you for this kind of overview time. But now what I want to do is spend a little bit of time getting us up and moving. And here are just different layers to culture. Again, there's ethnic culture. We talked about different layers to our culture and our identities. Here are some ways to think about that. But using this list, I'm going to ask you to find someone in the room that you don't think that you feel is culturally different than you. And again, there's so many different layers to culture. So frankly, everyone in the room is culturally different than you, and in some ways they're culturally similar than you. So really, you could find anyone, but find somebody in the room, please, that is culturally different than you, and introduce yourself, where you work, what you're hoping to get out of today, and then be willing to share possibly 3 aspects of your cultural identity with the other person. Okay? All right, so time to meet Marie. So thank you all. So I'm interested to hear from you. How was that experience, both from sharing 3 layers of your identity and then also hearing someone else share theirs? Who'd be willing to share their experience? Thank you, and thank you for admitting that we all have biases and stereotypes, right? And they're at play all the time. And sometimes they're things that come to mind, and oftentimes they're things that happen so quickly we don't realize they're at play. And not only that's towards others, and then others towards us, right? So there's like this reciprocal kind of energy that's happening that is at play often, and to disrupt it is really, really powerful. And so, but oftentimes in our culture, we don't make it safe to do this type of talk in our American culture. Why do you think that is? Thank you. So you're talking about, because the impact is harmful, right, in our experience, but we oftentimes don't realize that. But yeah, thank you. Thank you. And yet, to unpack that, thank you. I mean, can you all tell, well, don't answer this, please. I need to lose some weight, right? Like my body structure is here and present, right? The ways in which we think about it and the judgments we put next to it, that's the part that I think you're talking about, right? It's the fear of judgment. And then it goes back to what we were talking about, the power imbalances, that certain groups get certain powers, right? And so if we just think about body structure, there's a beauty norm, right, in our culture. And those that are not part of the beauty norm are aware of it. And they're aware of it in lots of different ways. And so it goes back to the power, non-power, or less power. And so I think that going back to, there's high stakes connected to these conversations, what you're saying, right? The vulnerability. Our immigration status and our national, origin, that's different in 2018 than it might have felt like in 2008, right? There's different layers to that because of the obvious political environment. And then again, because of the way in which our culture functions, where certain groups get power, there's kind of this message, and it's we don't want to talk about it, and it's at times considered impolite. But how does that cultural reality harm those families we're serving? So if it's impolite, if one of the things we know is that the person is wise, right? If one of the things we know is that the family that we're trying to serve, they are wise to what they need, to how we can show up for them, to who they are and how we can best serve them, right? They're the best expert in that. Again, back to that example in Oakland, those doctors recognized that while they had this book knowledge, they were lacking what that person in front of them needed. How did they feel about the medical environment? What was their cultural background? What was their kind of faith or religious perspective about medical treatment, right? All the different layers, what the generational, how somebody in their 80s feels about it versus someone who's in their teen years. All these dynamics are at play. So you can have this medical knowledge, or we can have the expertise we bring, and yet if we're not able to have conversations about the expert, the person we're trying to help, there's inherently going to be a disconnect, right? Kind of back to that intention is this, but our impact might be missing it. But I'm recognizing and I'm owning that our culture, our US culture, especially in certain ways, we kind of are taught to push this aside, right? We're kind of taught it's impolite, that we should just go into class and do our lesson. And it's irregardless of who's in our seats, right? We should all get the same lesson. But we all talked about ways in which that's not happening. We already unpacked that. But then we don't really kind of make it safe to talk about why that's not happening, or ways that doesn't, how this lesson might be meeting the needs of this student, but not the needs of this student. Or it might be affirming the cultural identity of this student and negating the cultural identity of this student and that student. Right? But if we don't talk about it, if we don't have space, then we really don't get to disrupt it, right? We don't get to fix that. So, thank you. Thank you for doing it, because it's not easy, right? Like we just talked about. But I appreciate you doing that. So I'm going to go back a little bit, because one of the things that's really important, and I know many of us in our programs, whatever training program we had, we spend a lot of time recognizing cultural proficiency, cultural relevance, cultural competence, right? We spend a lot of times really recognizing that we need to do a better job. We need to do a better job of meeting the needs of all kids. And again, the example of the Oakland, the doctors are learning ways that, the ways in which you serve clients. So for me, I'm from San Diego, and we had a huge influx of refugees during the Afghan war. We still do in our school district, and we were getting about 350 families a year. So we would have our refugee agencies come in and help us in the schools, really know how to work with refugee students, really know how to unpack what it means to, they're coming out of camps in this country. So really there was some good technical knowledge that they were giving us. And yet, that's kind of that competence piece. They were letting us know to be considerate of this, or that these were some of the cultural norms that we might be coming into play, right? So they were giving us that, like, here's what it means to serve a family who. And some of that was really, really good. But sometimes we walk away and go, got it. I know what these Afghan family needs, right? Or I know what this, fill in the blank family needs. But the cultural humility component is more about recognizing that we don't. And making it safe to really recognize that it's ongoing learning, that it's the expert in front of us that we're here to serve, that it's teachable, but we're also the student, right? So while we might have expertise, they have their expertise, and our goal is to help them so their expertise is equally, if not more valuable than ours. And then together we can get to the answer. To recognize that I don't know, and I loved your example here that you both might be Mexican and you both might be Catholic, but I guarantee there's things that you're gonna need that are different than what you need, right? And I don't know what those are, but again, it's not to say that, oh, I get, Latino women from Mexico need this, right? And because that would be more in that competence part and not recognizing that we still have individuals in front of us with their expertise. And so the humility part is really that partnership, it's shared decision making, and this is really can be uncomfortable because as we were talking earlier about those power dynamics, we have our own power dynamics in our organizations. So some organizations give us more permission to engage our families in a way that's fluid and reciprocal. And some organizations kind of want us to be those experts that go in and give, right? And so that kind of takes us more towards the competence. Any questions about competence versus humility? Great job. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time asking you to turn back to your tables. And just, if you can spend a minute jotting down, each of you will have a sheet, just think about ways in which your program is competent, culturally competent, your programs, your services. So again, a good example of culturally competent could be that you have enrollment forms for multiple languages, right? So that's which is great. That kind of goes a little bit into humility, but you can put that wherever you'd like to go. And then think about ways, and I'll put the 3 principles back up, ways in which your program you bring cultural humility into your programs and services. All right, I'm interrupting for 1 minute. Now each of you should have some table conversations, and I've asterisked down to the number 3, it's in the green, because we've already done a lot of the top part. And I am seeing the energy. So if you can now, as a table, start with number 3 and unpack. If all of you can share and respond to each question, if you get through all the questions, great. If you get through 2, that's great too. So let me know if you need any help, but enjoy the conversations. So can we talk a little bit about your great learning and sharing at your tables? What kind of stands out for you in your conversation, or what are some takeaways? Either that you shared, that you saw others, great idea, and that maybe others would as well, or that you took away from someone else. So it sounds like you guys have started to really kind of unpack this and think about this, but also it sounds like you guys are already doing much of this. But I also want to recognize that the role that you do and the support that you provide is really making a difference for those that we're trying to serve. And so whether, as our friend shared, hiring me, so the fact that she's showing up every day is a form of cultural competence, cultural humility, and yet our organizations are still based very much in those historical power dynamics, right? And so sometimes we can show up into organizations that might have some microaggression experiences for us, right? Or we might really be under-resourced and feel the burden of that. Or we might have the additional stress of our family needs and our work needs and all of these things as we're trying to show up. So coming here today and being part of this conversation, it's also very much applicable to each of us as individuals and then those we're serving. So I very much appreciate the time with you and to have the chance to engage with you. I'm wondering if somebody would be willing to read this I can statement. And just so you know, someone asked if they could have some slides, so can I send you the slides, Judy?
Sure.
Then we can get them out. Would somebody be willing? I'll read it. Okay.
I can avoid essentializing students from identity groups different from my own. Despite the popularity of workshops and literature that suggests that we need to know only one dimension of a student's identity in order to know her or his learning needs, culture, and proclivities, such a position is dangerously simplistic. Similarly, despite popular belief, there's no such thing as a singular, predictable, culture of poverty, or Asian culture. All girls and women do not share a single learning style. One's racial identity is not a reasonable predictor of her or his learning preferences or competencies. I will refuse these simplifications and focus instead on individual students' interests and needs.
Thank you. So there's our work ahead, and that's pretty much what I'm confident you do every day. But before I turn it over, and there's more slides in here, I want to end with, back on you guys. Would somebody be willing to read this slide?
I can celebrate myself as an educator. I can and should also celebrate every moment I spend in self-reflection regarding my practice, however challenging, because it will make me a better educator, and that is something to celebrate.
Exactly. So you being here today is something to celebrate, and I thank you for that. So can we?